Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this episode, we are going to be diving into an insightful conversation from of the professional training that I do, the breath science certification, taking a question that, if I'm going to be completely honest with you, it was a challenging question to answer. I'm going to give you the reasons why, but I felt like I worked through it pretty well, and I think this is a valuable discussion to have because it helps people to understand things such as stress triggers emotions and stress and reaction and kind of at the extreme levels. So today we're going to dive into what a lady on my course who is a psychologist, and she asked me a question about interoception and interoceptive exposure in people with binge eating disorders. Now you might be thinking, that's crazy. That's nothing to do with the breath. It's completely relevant because binge eating is often related to safeties of being full or hunger being as a mark of a danger. So what typically happens when people are hungry with binge eating disorder is that they feel threatened. And in this actual episode, in this question, the psychologist was even saying that this lady does define extreme fullness as a signal of safety and hunger as a marker of danger. And so therefore we have this kind of relationship. Okay, and the relationship is to a sensation. That sensation of hunger is what we typically call a homeostatic affect. Affect being a feeling in our body that primes our minds, then take an action in a certain behavior. Obviously, when we're typically hungry, we feel that, we go and get food. And so we're going to look at this through a predictive coding lens, meaning that homeostatic affects are there not to simply when glucose drops, or when the stomach is empty, or when water is and salts are not correct in the body, meaning we've gone outside of homeostasis, then we feel the sensation. That's not what happens. Sensations arrive before homeostasis is even disrupted. And so we're drawing on predictive processing, affect neuroscience, particularly Jaak Panksepp's work on primal affective systems. So it is a segment that is from my professional training, the breath science certification. And so this training covers an array of different areas around breathing. In fact, every area I believe that you can think of. And so it's the deepest form of training. And if you want to check that out, visit schoolofbreathscience.com. Of course, if you enjoy this sort of conversation, just subscribe as well. We're going to illustrate how these instinctual drives of hunger can also then be conditioned to feelings of things like shame and fear, which then creates this cycle, which needs kind of mindful reframing. And how can we actually then go to use something like breath work or breathing or practical strategies that can actually help an individual to be able to create some space, and so that they can start to relearn what potential signals mean. That's what exposure is. So if you don't know what interoception essentially is all the sensations that we feel from within our skin inwards. So exteroception would be our sight, our hearing, our taste, our touch. Touch is a sensitive one. There's still arguments around whether that's interoceptive or exteroceptive. But the conscious mind is constantly is competing. Interoception and exteroception are competing for each other through what we call salience, the most important aspect of this. And so someone feeling hungry, I can guarantee you, if you feel hungry and you're still trying to face and do your work and be productive and focus, there's competition for that. You want to drive and go and get some food. And so that becomes the hierarchical value that is necessary for survival. Of course, fasting changes that, and fasting in this case would be an interoceptive exposure. So if someone has a poor relationship to hunger, for example, then we can expose them to that potentially. This is an education, not advice. I'm not a psychologist. It was a dialogue with a psychologist, so I was happy to go there. We can expose people to that and start to change that relationship to things like with using breathwork, for example, to reduce the arousal, to reappraise the sensation, and therefore we can start to use things like cognitive behavioral therapy. Why could I speak to this? Just to give you a little bit of background, I do remember when I was training as a clinical scientist, I had a particular patient that had sleep apnea, and one of the treatment therapies that she had to get put on was called CPAP therapy, continuous positive airway pressure, which is a machine that blows air through a tube into a mask, and we have to put a mask on the face. Now, this particular lady, even the thought of having a mask on her face just made her feel panicky. And so she was like, look, I don't think I can do this. And so I was kind of like, I don't feel competent. If I can't treat every single patient that I can treat because someone has anxiety or has panic related to a mask, then I don't feel like I can do my job fully. So as a part of my training, there were a few CPD areas that I could kind of lean into. So I thought I'd write to the Council of Clinical Psychologists in Nottingham and see whether I could actually get onto some form of cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy training, just the fundamentals, just to see whether I could treat my clients better. And they actually welcomed me. And so I spent a 3-day training working with some psychologists and understanding some concepts around thought thinking, exposure, the nervous system, and like the what goes through the mind and mindfulness, and how we can use cognitive behavioral therapy to help people with these. So the outcome was actually I managed, over the space of about 6 weeks, I managed to get this lady from being completely panicky about wearing a mask to gradually then having a mask in her hand and putting it on her face, then being able to wear the mask for 10 to 20 minutes with without having air come through, then plugging the machine in on a different week. And eventually, so she took that machine home, managed to put it on at home on her own without me being there, and eventually then to be able to use that for 4 or 5 hours a night, which is what we'd say is a compliant level of therapy for CPAP therapy. And so it did wonders. And I've stuck with that. I've used it many a times with my clients now. And I truly believe that breath hold training is actually the form of interoceptive exposure. It's an exposure to a sensation of air hunger, and it changes that psychological relationship. That's what the majority of people with anxiety or panic or people who are chronically stressed have when they hold the breath and they get that real fast urge to breathe. It's most likely a psychological relationship and emotional change that we have. So we're going to dive into this. This obviously is relevant for any clinician, but it's also relevant for anyone who works with people, just to understand the concepts. I'm not going to say that this is obviously a training for you. I would recommend that you go out there and get some training yourself, or of course join my breath science certification, and you're going to get a deeper understanding that around the breath. And so share your comments. Let me know at the bottom. This is from a Q&A in the breath science certification, a 10-minute block. And so with this foundation in place, let's end the conversation.
I've got 2 overarching questions, and one was related to the interoceptive exposure and the physiology aspect. I had this come up with a client where they said their perception of safety versus danger was safety means overfull to the brim and danger means hunger. I just wanted to know your take on that.
Overfull to the brim.
They have a binge eating disorder. If you had any thoughts on what this module touches on in terms of that interoceptive and exposure and changing that relationship to that sensation.
Yeah. What comes up for me there is we talk about affect in here, and we talk about Pensep's work in terms of the emotional affects. Hunger is a instinctual homeostatic affect, and there is a very deep unconscious relationship that we build to these hunger, air hunger being another one that's homeostatic, thirst, sleepiness. These are all primitive drives. And essentially when we have relationships or conditioning to primitive drives, there is often a very challenging learned component to that, but deep rooted. The story behind that concept of when I'm really full to the brim, that means I'm safe. When I'm hungry, that means I'm in danger. That is very primitive in itself. In some aspects, there is an element of truth to it, but it doesn't fit in the society in the way we live today, or way that she lives today. Whereas they're obviously quite clearly looking at it as a very primitive aspect of, if I don't have food, I'm in danger. If I have lots of food, I'm very safe. So there's a story component, but then there's, the accuracy of the interoceptive component there, and the awareness. The mindfulness element of being able to sit with a sensation of hunger is very challenging to observe because it's so instinctual. I'm trying to get at the point that these things aren't something that we usually just sit and observe. You just go and get food. Whereas someone with an eating disorder will notice a sensation, then perhaps another emotion appears. So what is the mindful element or the practice that they can potentially put into place? This is not me telling you what to do at all. It's me just thinking out loud, because it's a challenging question. It's a really challenging question for me. What emotion is also tied to the sensation that arises? Because it's a secondary emotion that typically, because hunger's hunger. It's primitive, it's primal. And most of us, if we don't have a poor relationship to food, it's just natural to do what we need to do to go and eat food, but we're not assessing it. But the secondary emotion that's attached to it is what then causes the assessment: shame, guilt, fear, whatever that is. And then in between those two things is where the space needs to be created to become that observer, as you had mentioned. And then, as I'm not a psychologist, it's then what is the exposure? And this is me just thinking out loud again, please don't take this as a recommendation. Is it looking at patterns of when safety and threat appear in terms of the day around hunger? Does the person actually have regular eating patterns? And can they lean into that hunger and explore it as a sensation versus something to judge?
Tying in, I'm hearing a layering effect. We've spoken in the last two modules about how physiology drives psychology. Is there any relationship between that primitive drive of hunger and the threat versus safety and shifts in breathing or tension and how that feeds into layers of shame, guilt, and story?
If you talk about it through the lens of predictive coding and predictive processing, that when we are hungry, there typically hunger appears before we go outside of homeostasis. That's what a primitive homeostatic affect is there to do. Prevent your glucose from dropping by eating food before that actually happens, by learning to have a particular behavior in place, i.e., breakfast, lunch, dinner, to avoid your body going outside. So hunger will appear before, actually, in most people, will appear before glucose eating shifts. Similar to air hunger. You hold your breath, people might get to maybe 41, 42 millimeters of mercury before they actually get air hunger. It doesn't mean it's outside of the normal range. It means it's a warning sign that you're going outside. But what that does is it starts to eventually generate a sensation. That the predictive error generates the sensation. That's what drives you. Yeah. So the way that people can either overcome a predictive error is to take an action to resolve that, which would be then typically to go and get food. But if people don't get food, a sensation will arise. The perception of a sensation can change. For example, emotion. If you're hungry and you don't get food, you get hungry. The emotion changes. This is documented in the literature that people who have eating disorders, it's a different emotion that might appear. And it becomes a judgmental emotion. But it is driving up arousal. Because that arousal is there for you to go and find resources. So yes, there is a truth to that. If someone isn't hungry and arousal rises and they are regulated in their nervous system, they may feel fear, shame, or guilt with a level of high arousal.
That makes sense. And I suppose layering within the course and the outline and the exercises and the practices that we're doing, kind of what I'm taking from that is then breaking it down is that observation, that mindful curiosity, and then having kind of some buffer between the stimulus and the response that you can then choose. Like you might still be hungry and that's okay, but then you can engage in a mindful eating way rather than a compulsive reactive form.
So rather than the action going towards a binge eat, the action is to try and sit with a form of regulation or arousal juicing activity first to create that space. But because it is so primitive, it's deep rooted, people will struggle to notice the space. The practice has to come outside of the hunger first. It has to be put in place where if this person has set meal times, there is a practice around 5 minutes before that set meal time of bringing down arousal, coming into the body, being aware, slowing down, being mindful, and then consuming the food in a non-judgmental manner.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so coherence breathing, there is evidence to show that coherence breathing can be a powerful tool for, I can see if I can source out the literature that I read, but it was around food addiction or people who have eating disorders. And it did reduce binge eating. And so I'll see if I can source that literature.
Be great.
Yeah.
Just on that, Maureen, what's the coherence breathing just to implement breathwork practices before you're consuming food to calm your state down? Is that?
Yeah. So when there is an urge, essentially, when there's an urge, rather than the behavior going straight towards resolving the urge in a way that is maladaptive, let's say, by binge eating, smoking, drinking, whatever that is, it's like trying to attach that coherent breathing to the urge first to be more mindful of the sensation and aware of the sensation. But like I say, because it's so primitive, it's hard to do it. It's hard to tell someone, hey, when you get an urge, just breathe. So there needs to be practice beforehand. And it needs to be put into a place where urges and patterns occur. And so you might be able to do some form of window of tolerance diary or documentation. Is there then a common pattern? Can we then put the action of coherent breathing near that pattern to just create some space and to regulate?
That's really helpful.
Yeah, how I'd approach it, just because it would be very challenging. It's easy for all to say, my relationship with food at times is amazing, but then I'll have a binge eat. And I do wish that I was able to just go, do you know what? Just breathe for a moment and have clarity. But for me, there isn't a pattern because it's not regular. Perhaps there is a pattern. Is there a trigger? What is the trigger? Now, is it the sensation of hunger or is it stress? Is it another emotion? So that exploration itself can come again after the practice is built in.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you, Mark.
You're welcome. And thank you for asking that question, because it was a challenging question for me to work through, but I tried to work through it my best as I can.
Loved the way you work through it.
Now, I hope you enjoyed that detailed conversation there. It was something that I worked through, and I like exploring these questions. Of course, during the training, I'm also going to put boundaries in place and say, hey, actually, I don't know the answer to this question. I almost didn't want to have this conversation here, but given it was the fact that it was a psychologist on the other end, and we can relate this same concept to breath-hold training, it was a valuable conversation to everyone to have. And I thought that it went well, and therefore that's the reason why I'm putting that on here. So if you are very interested and we can realize from this that this training is much more than the breath, there's much more anchors and much more a deeper understanding. We have 13 different modules. It's probably the most advanced academic or science training outside of academia, pulling all this wellness practices together in terms of functional breathing, nervous system, emotions and psychology, breathing and exercise, cold and heat exposure, sleep disorder breathing, burnout management, clinically assessing, and breathwork in the psyche and coaching frameworks. And there's just nothing else out there. If you're a breathwork facilitator right now and you wish to advance your skills, I'd recommend that you check out schoolofbreathscience.com, check out our courses, and go away and actually make an application, submit an application, let's jump on a call. If you're a professional, I would also recommend that you check it out as well, because you're going to be able to add additional tools to your life. Of course, if you enjoyed this, like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'll catch you soon.